Let's talk about Kenya now. In less than 3 months, citizens went to the polls twice to vote for president. The August 8th election was nullified by the Supreme Court after allegations of irregularities. The new date was set for October 25th, but even the electoral officials said they could not guarantee a credible outcome. The main opposition candidate, Raila Odinga, accused the president, Uhuru Kenyatta, of fraud. He dropped out of the race, that is Odinga, and called for a boycott. There were clashes with the police during demonstrations against the election, and at least 5 people were killed. It is at this point that we welcome from Albany in New York, Nanjala Inyabola. She is a writer and political analyst. Nanjala, welcome to the show. Nice to have you with us. So, Kenya appears to be sinking deeper into political crisis. 2 elections in less than 3 months, as I pointed out. So we have a political stalemate here, which has turned violent again. What is happening?
Well, I think we have to take the violence in context. What we have, the kind of violence that we have happening in Kenya this week is more reminiscent of what we saw in 1992 and 1997 than what we saw in 2007. And I say this because this is violence that's coming from the state. Every single person who's been killed in Kenya right now, up to this point, has been killed by the state. And that is not in any way to diminish the seriousness of it. That's not in any way to say that this is not something that is worth watching. It's merely to say that it's qualitatively different and it needs a different kind of attention. We need more pressure on the state to enforce fair policing across the country. I think that, you know, we need to be conscious of the fact that a constitutional crisis does not necessarily need to lead to violence, and I think that's really the challenge that we're trying to we're seeing people trying to negotiate in Kenya. Definitely at this point, a constitutional crisis seems inevitable. The election was called for on October 26th, and the turnout has been appalling. It's been the lowest turnout in electoral history in Kenya, and that's a signaling mechanism that people didn't feel that this particular election, this particular rerun, was credible enough to demand their time or energy.
Well, you say a bigger focus should be pointed at the government, that more pressure should be put on the government. Who puts that pressure on the Kenyan government?
Well, partly the Kenyan people, but partly also the international community. It's one of the things that came out of the August 8th version of the election was that there was so much attention on the opposition and so many calls for the opposition to stay calm and for the opposition to, you know, play by the rules. And even we saw this former U.S. Secretary of State telling the opposition leader to concede defeat, even though he had said that there were just far too many irregularities and illegalities in the process. We've not seen any kind of pressure being put on the government until yesterday. Finally, the EU issued a statement in which they explicitly asked the government to refrain from excessive use of force. But that statement and those statements from the different observers, the AU observers, the East African community observers, they should have been making these statements all the way back in August. This is not something that has just started. You know, the first deaths happened on August 11th after the result was announced. Why hasn't there been pressure on the police force in Kenya to actually show restraint and right, stop, you know, this disproportionate policing? Okay,
now, Jala, very quickly, tell me, what do you think has to happen next? I mean, do you have another election, a third one?
It's an extraordinarily
difficult... I'll get to you, John.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead, go ahead.
If the law is to be followed, certainly I think another election is on the card. If we go strictly by the letter of the law, I don't think that this election was in many ways worse than the August election. Yeah. Not only in the matter of turnout, but in some of the irregularities that we've seen coming in, of forms being altered, of things not being submitted in the correct format, and I think if we go by the letter of the law, another election is almost inevitable. The big question is, are the big political actors willing to be bound by the provisions of the law?
Right. John, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry for the interruption before. This is such an extraordinarily complex situation because in a different way than our first example, you also have the primacy of rule of law here. I mean, the silver lining is that the Election Commission declared the first election nullified because of these irregularities. It wasn't something that was sweeping or dominating the sense of the political atmosphere in Nairobi, but they wanted as perfect or as close to perfect an electoral process as possible. And so they declared that first election nullified. The tragedy is that Kenya is probably the bastion of democratic politics in Africa. And so it's not just a Kenya issue, it really is an Africa-wide issue. And if you have democratic standards and principles collapsing in Kenya, it forebodes in the worst direction possible after an era where the last 5, 10, 15 years, you've seen a surge of democratic activity throughout the continent. So this is important for what's happening inside of Kenya and what's happening among Kenya's neighbors as well.
Paolo, you've been to Kenya many times.
Yes.
So, as John pointed out, the Kenyan Supreme Court threw out the results of the first election, saying that it was not valid, ordered a new election, and we've just seen what's happened. Let's take a listen to what the chair of the Kenyan Election Commission, Wafula Chebukati, had to say. Let's watch this.
Critical changes in key secretariat staff, free, fair, and credible elections will surely be compromised.
Free and fair elections will be compromised. So, as the opposition leader, Raila Odinga, does he have a point there?
Well, yes, and again, keep in mind, if I'm not mistaken, according to the Kenyan constitution, even if the turnout had been higher, right? This is, as the other guest pointed out, it's appalling, 33%. Elections have to be held in all precincts. In other words, in all constituencies, even if some of them that boycott had been very effective, and indeed they didn't vote. That's enough to annul the elections, according to Kenyan law. So that's another wrinkle in all this. But more broadly, the results have been so appalling that it's hard for, assuming Kenyatta gets re-elected, that he gets a majority of the 33%. You think that's a mandate? And in the wake of all this, and let's not forget, he's got an indictment against himself because of violence that took place the other time, the other election. So there's a very bad history here, and of course this is compounded by the fact that everybody knows, but from a legal standpoint has really no value, that this is a re-edition of another, Kikuyu versus Luo rivalry. This is historic tribal rivalry. Odinga's father was the main opponent of Kenyatta's father. So we're replaying this unfortunate situation. Of course, now with all the trappings of modernity and legality and constitution and whatever. But this is essentially a major tribal fight that has not been resolved because the Luo are the underdogs and the Kikuyu hold most of the power in Kenya. And they have no intention of giving it up.
Right.
And unfortunately, under the circumstances, Uhuru's legitimacy is really undermined.
I want to move on to the Japanese election in just a moment. But first, Nanjala, I want to give you 30 seconds to respond to that. Is this essentially a tribal conflict that we're seeing?
I think it's a conflation of two things. I think there's definitely an element of ethnicity that we need to pay attention to, especially in what is motivating different actors to behave the way they do. But there's definitely a bigger issue at question. There are many, many millions of Kenyans who are refusing to participate in the process as it stands because they don't think it's legitimate. It has nothing to do with Raila as an individual. It has nothing to do with Kenyatta as an individual. They're really saying that at this point, after 5 multi-party elections, we should be doing better than we are right now.